Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Asia Institute's seminar. Today is Saturday, February 18th, 2012, and we're honored to have a distinguished group of discussants for today's seminar, Global Perspectives on Korea's Potential in Research and Business. Let me just say briefly that for many of us who've been in Korea for more than a couple days, we're struck at the remarkable potential that lies in Korea. We find it in every aspect of Korea, which is a very happening place these days. But at the same time, we encounter various challenges in adjusting to Korean culture, and we see aspects in which Korea has enormous potential, but has a little bit of trouble sort of getting over the initial hump in terms of fully making use of that potential. So today we have brought together four individuals. The first is Hae-suk Lee, who is the director, Dr. Hae-suk Lee, director of the Korea Advanced Institute of Women in Science, Engineering, and Technology, professor at Hoegi University. Thank you for being with us today. We also have Mr. Joel Nomberger, who's Director of Korea Tech Innovation Program of the IC² Institute, University of Texas, Austin, which is located in Suwon in Kyung-Hee-dong. We also have Professor Abraham Lee of Hoegi-dong University, who's also a consultant for PSI Connect. Welcome. And then Mr. Vince Rubino, who is Senior Quality Assurance Advisor for Shijin here in Seoul. Each one of these individuals has, I think, a very rich experience with Korea in many aspects, both in terms of business and in terms of technology and research. I think by this sort of comprehensive and sort of multi-perspective approach, we can get the best sense of what Korea's full potential is, and maybe through our interactive discussion between the five of us and with the audience here, we'll find some aspects that maybe haven't occurred to any of us yet. So let's start with just a short introduction of perspective, starting with Professor Lee.
Starting me? Yeah, well, actually I'm a substitute, so I'm not really well prepared, I think. As Professor Emanuel introduced, I'm the director of the Korea Institute for Women in Science, Engineering, and Technology, which is to support the women in science and engineering and technology. This is our institute is founded by, established by the under the legal basis of there is the law, the act for supporting women in science and engineering, which is made in 2002, so it's already 10 years. One of the reasons that such a law was started, or what do you say? Yeah, was because in 2000 or before 2000, there were only 9 point somewhat women in research and development in that area, which is science, engineering, and technology. And as you already know, that the Human Development Index in Korea is fairly high compared to the gender empowerment measure, especially during the foreign crisis in 1997. There was a report by McKinsey which says that utilizing women's brain power is most important for Korea's future competitiveness. Another report came out in 2001, Women Korea, again, the Korea must utilize under-leveraged female talent to become an advanced nation. So that's all together, that's the basis for such a law came out. But the direct reason was because in 2001, at that time, the Minister of Science and Technology, Yang Kim, announced the recruitment target system for women scientists and engineers applied to the government institute, which even though he declared that policy, but there was no legal basis, so they have to do something. So 2002, the Act on Fostering and Supporting Women Scientists and Engineers in Technology was legislated by Ministry of Science and Technology, and our institute was established by that law. Because of that law, there were many the improvements made, not only the government or public basis, but also the NGO level. So before 2000, there were very few women scientist associations. But now there are very many, over 30. So there was even the COPS, which is Korea Federation of Women Science and Engineering, Science and Technology Associations. And I think Dr. Kim, Kim is the president at the moment, and she was supposed to come today actually, but she couldn't come. So because of that law, there was a policy, and also the government made the master plan for women scientists and engineers, which is even started 2 years before then the main the master plan for all scientists and engineers in Korea. But that doesn't mean that the master plan for fostering and supporting women in that area is a lot better than the master plan. So they divided 3 different parts, which is fostering and the utilization for women in that area, and also infrastructure. And the fostering, there were 4 different programs. Women into Science and Engineering, which for girls, science-friendly education and various programs. And also, there were very few women in engineering, so they developed a program or started a program, Women in Engineering, and also there is female graduate students in engineering. And also the recruitment target system for women in SET introduced, and also recruitment target system for female faculty in the university. So it's been going on for 10 years. So obviously there is some policy achievement. Actually I prepared the PPT, for the we had a little bit of the quantitative basis increased number of female professors by the recruitment target system, and also the target goal for the women, the female researchers in the government-funded research institute is 30%, but at the moment it's only a little bit over to 80%, so it's a long way to go. But there is a very good sign which came out just last year, is that the status of principal investigators of government-supported research and development project. It's not very high, but the ages under 30 or between 30 and 40, it's the portion of female is fairly high, sometimes even higher than male. So, but in 40s, after 40s, 40s and 50s, 60s, the female portion is really low compared to the. So but it's promising because the younger generation is doing very good. And another thing that I'd like to point out is some qualitative improvement. The PISA result, the achievement of the students in 2000, there is a big gap between girls and boys' achievement in mathematics and science. But after 10 years of fostering programs, and now in 2009, there are only a couple of points difference between boys and girls in mathematics. And in science, there are even the female student did better. So it's we had a fairly good policy achievement last 10 years. However, we have very few women in decision-making positions in either group. So that's there are two different reasons we have to work on that, because there are very few role models for the girls, and also the women are more interested in participating in the decision-making process these days. So that's what we've been working on, our institute, together with these women's associations. Maybe I'll take some questions later. Excellent.
Well, I think in terms of the potential for Korea, women is a very large piece of the equation. We find often among students that the best students are in fact women today. And this issue of how you can fully utilize the full potential of women in Korea is a major question. Joe?
So I'm trying to think of a good way to segue. I think a lot of us that have familiarity with Korea through the years believe that the future of Korea is very, very closely tied with the future of women in Korea and in business and science and technology. Of the things I've achieved in Korea, I think the thing I'm most proud of is that my administrative assistant when I started here has gone to the U.S., gone through a Master's of Science and Technology Commercialization program, and is now heading the globalization efforts of one of the Korean innovators that came through our program. So I think the theme of my comments today will be focused somewhat around seeding and DNA change in some of the, I guess, the more deep-seated Korean cultural artifacts that may impair future growth. But to give you some perspective on that, in 1979, I was living in Cheongdo, about a half a mile up the hill from the Blue House, and I went out one morning to get the milk like we did every morning that was delivered by the Seventh-day Adventist dairy, which was the only place you could get cow's milk in those days. And I went out to pick it up, and there was a Korean soldier standing outside the door who pointed his M16 at me and said, "You might want to go back inside." So we went back in and turned on the news, and there was this big news broadcast about how President Park Chung-hee was indisposed. And he was indisposed long enough for the military to deploy all the way around the Blue House, at which point it was announced that he'd been assassinated. So, as someone that's been here from that point on, I've often thought of what perspective President Park Chung-hee must have had when he started as the president of South Korea, sitting down with his cabinet and saying, okay, here's what we've got. We've got a peninsula that's surrounded by ocean on three sides with some of the highest tides in the world, which make it very difficult to use. We're sandwiched between Japan and North Korea and China. We have no natural resources, and we have 40 million people we need to feed. What do we do? And, tough call, right? So I think President Park's administration is rightly credited with a lot of what has become the Korean economic miracle. So starting from those humble beginnings, and for those of you that aren't that familiar with this history, I wish I could convey to you what Korea was like in the mid to late 70s, because when you come to Korea now and compare it to what it was then, it's in a single generation, this country has completely transformed itself. So when people talk about the potential for future for Korea, I just look at that and say, what are you talking about? This is one of the few places you really don't need to worry that much. But I think because people in Korea are so much caught up in the process of the Korean evolutionary miracle, sometimes they become either too arrogant or too critical of their own success and their own history and their own progress. In the most recent economic downturn in Korea, there was a lot of negative press here about how Korea was going to be sorely impacted by the horrible economy and how bad everything was going to be. And at the time, I wrote but didn't publish an article that said, you know what, Korea's going to be fine, because this economic downturn is going to really hurt people that can't deal with difficult economic times. But Korea is always in difficult economic times, because it is always a net import-export driven economy that has no natural resources and 50 million people it needs to feed. So the real future, I think, of Korea and its economy is driven by the fundamental fact that the Korean economy is built on a table stakes model, not a profit-driven model. Western economics and traditional capitalism are driven by maximizing return to shareholders. Korean businesses are driven by how do we feed our families at a very fundamental level. And I think that consistently has driven an ethic in this culture that will continue to support it in the future. Having said that, there are some serious transitional problems having to do with as you know, Korea's moniker is the hermit kingdom. When I talk to people outside of Korea about coming here, I say to them, don't think of Korea as a country. Korea is a 48 million member family. People in Korea are genetically more closely related than any 5 members of a neighborhood living as neighbors in North America, where you'll have a Chinese family next to a Hungarian family, next to a Polish family, next to a German family, next to an English family. In this country, you've got 6,000 years of family growth together. And as with all families, that has benefits and detriments. And one of the challenges, I think, for Korea, and this is very much tied to women in business, science, and technology, is developing a gender-neutral view of performance, which, in my opinion, is a generational change. That's something Korean men that are my age, and I know I'm old, that's the good news. Korean men that are my age are probably not going to change their view of women in the workforce. And they're not, I mean, I had a very intense conversation with the guy who used to run Oracle Korea when I was working for Oracle, with a middle-aged woman with 3 children coming back into the workforce. And after her impassioned story about how she felt unfulfilled and needed to go back to work and was so excited, he said, go home and take care of your kids. And I think that attitude in that generation is going to be very, very difficult to break. I think there will be a transitional generation, which is the generation now, where there's tremendous opportunity for women to enter, to compete, to prove, and to demonstrate. There will be challenges associated with that. And then I think a generation from now will look back on this more as historical than as reality, as women take those decision-making roles and drive their way into the future. The one final comment I would make is, again, going back to the International Monetary Fund report from the economic crisis of the late 1990s. The 2 key points that came out of that report, the view on women in Korean tech society was one point. The second point was the role of small and medium enterprise in Korea. So this all ties together, believe it or not. Going back to President Park Chung-hee, the genius of his administration was to create a vertically integrated economy so that Korea could have isolated, vertically integrated, monolithic businesses that would be large enough to compete in the global economy. That was a very, very smart thing to do at the time. The cost now is that if you are not in, at the time of the currency crisis in 1996-97, 63% of Korean GDP was controlled by 13 group companies. That means if those companies took a wrong turn, blinked, rolled over, there would be 600 or 700 supply businesses beneath that chaebol company that would be squashed. And that really is what drove that crisis. So the IMF report really focused on driving strength in the small and medium enterprise. And I think today, now almost 15 years later, and this is maybe the most symptomatic thing for me about why I don't worry too much about Korea's future. When that announcement was made, there was also an 80-20 distribution of wealth in this country. 80% of the wealth controlled by 20% of the population. That disparity led to a lot of people with a great deal of power not wanting things to change. So as a result, it's been a very difficult process to change the perceptions and change the incentives and change the power structure to allow Korean small and medium businesses to engage and expand. And that really is why I'm here. I run a program in Kyung Hee Province that's, the content is delivered through the University of Texas at Austin, and we're funded by the Kyung Hee provincial government. And the program is basically Korean Tech Idol, is the best way to explain it in shorthand. It's for we work with higher education, public sector, private sector. So for public relations and sort of marketing purposes, we've developed a model that uses an actual competition among technology companies. But it's really a stealth method for us to get to and work with a large number of small and medium enterprises to help the innovators in those enterprises change their world perspective, help them change their entrepreneurial DNA, and help them understand what they need to do to get off the Korean Peninsula without having to funnel through a vertically integrated process. So I'll be happy to answer questions about that, but I think I've used my time as it is. So.
Thank you very much. We'll move on with Abraham, if you have some thoughts on the question of Korea's education.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to keep my comments rather short, and I think it would be most relevant to just point out some of the research that I'm currently doing on knowledge spillover, knowledge transfer. My study and my focus is on organizations and how they grow and develop and attain power and, in particular, bargaining power in the business world. And so some of the main points that I'd like to highlight in Korea's case is the concept of absorptive capacity, and that's the ability of organizations to absorb knowledge, to keep and learn, and to be a learning organization. That's not something that organizations do very well all the time. And secondly, I'd like to also emphasize path dependence. Path dependence is the idea that when an organization, all organizations have some kind of culture or rules, social norms and values in which they operate by. Korea has a lot of that. Unfortunately, they have a lot of good things, as our speaker had just mentioned, but also a lot of bad things that lock them in and predisposes them to thinking in certain ways that keep out certain kinds of knowledge that they could be. For instance, the common story about Koreans that they're not creative enough. Why don't we have a Steve Jobs in Korea? Why don't we have a Google in Korea? We have the technology. Why don't we have homegrown grassroots movement to be more innovative and design focused and broad big picture thinkers in Korea? So path dependence is something else. And thirdly, I wanted to emphasize crisis in leadership. Korea is always struggling with leadership ideas. There's Korean. When I first came to Korea, there's this or saying in Korea that says, "When my cousin buys land, my stomach hurts." And I think you get the gist of that. You know, when someone is doing really well or they get into the best school, on the outside they'll applaud that person, but behind them, they're like, "Oh man, I wish he wasn't going ahead of me," or I wish he wasn't getting that promotion. There's a degree of unhappiness of seeing someone going ahead. Koreans are very kind of, they move together, and, you know, if it says be the Reds for a soccer team, everyone wears red and heads out there, no questions asked. You know, it's a communal effort to do everything in Korea, and so that could be powerful because, you know, it's like one, as you said, it's one big family, it's one big rally cry. People don't question that, you know, when the country starts to disintegrate, everybody's going to get together like during the Asia financial crisis. They'll get together and chip in their heirlooms, their gold, to keep Korea alive. So that's one of the beautiful things that's in Korea, that we don't see in other countries a lot of the times. They move together and they're very proud of their cultural identity. But again, that whole frame of mind can be predisposed to being very path dependent and locking people into thinking in certain very kind of narrow ways. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about knowledge spillover and knowledge transfer. This is a very big and important idea in organizational thought and organizational strategy. And the idea right now is, well, a lot of business research is focused on the importance of networks. How do we learn? Where do we get new knowledge? New knowledge is important for driving innovation, and innovation now is the driver for profit and wealth and new sources of revenue, and that's what Korea is looking for. And so Korea is emphasizing this next generation. Before, top 5 products were things like semiconductors, cell phones, television, you know, in the heavy industry, ships, you know, automobiles, but that's done now. And while they need to keep those moving, Korea has this additional burden of coming out with new, very risque, very kind of hot product items, dealing with energy conservation, environmental friendly type materials, and a slew of energy storage devices, slew of other next generation devices that they have to come out with. Where do they get the knowledge for that? So my research deals with knowledge transfer, knowledge acquisition. So to go back and talk about absorptive capacity, organizations, they're not all predisposed to learning very well. You have to be able to acquire knowledge, to be able to have the right people in your team to assimilate that knowledge and to enact on that knowledge and make products and services that can generate and draw people to it. That's not what Korea does very well and historically has not been very good at doing. The part that they do well is developing a cushion in people's okay, if you think of the basic sciences or math as a framework for cushioning what you learn, Korea does that very well. So they develop a good mental nest to be able to draw that knowledge, but to enact on it is not always something that they do very well. They do a lot of reverse engineering. They license out product, bring it back to Korea, figure out how it's made, and then try to bypass or circumvent any legal restrictions from copying it entirely from scratch. So that's the kind of way in which things have been generated for a while. So that's one way of circumventing legal restrictions from knowledge transfer. There are rules and regulations about what can move across borders and what you can do with what you get from other companies and partnerships and alliances. So what can we do to make Korea, so the challenge is, what can we do to make Korean organizations, this is not just Korean organizations, individually, how can we make Koreans more independent thinkers, learners, people who have the capacity to absorb knowledge, to run with that, and to recombine what they learn to something new. And that's what, you know, companies like Apple do very well. They haven't really invented anything new, but they recombine things that exist in the world and come out with really dynamic, innovative products. Secondly, I talked about absorptive capacity, and I don't have notes in front of me, so path dependence, yes, thank you. So organizations tend to, because of their very rigid rules and culture, and all organizations suffer from this. We see the case of IBM as a good example. They were, you know, they for many years thought of themselves as international business machines company. And until very late in the game, when other companies were moving quickly toward IT services, it wasn't until a very dynamic CEO came in and says, we can't rely on selling machines anymore. We have to be more software focused. We have to be more driven to B2B products. And that completely changed the game. And now IBM, the vast majority of what they sell are IT services for corporations. That's what Oracle's doing. That's what Google does very well. We have Kodak, who we recently learned is going bankrupt. Why? Because their path-dependent way of thinking, relying on their laurels from the past and the past successes, have driven them to think that there is no way they can fail. They actually came out with a digital camera, but they really weren't good at monetizing what they developed. And there are many companies like that. Well, besides the point of not being able to monetize something, organizations, once they get on a track in moving toward a certain direction, it's very difficult politically and otherwise for that company to veer off of that track and do something new, refreshing. And it takes sometimes, one of the things that the research shows is it really takes a complete change of leadership. I mean, a crisis has to happen. before that organization will completely switch gears and do something new. If you think about your families even, this exists within families. Families will acquire some maybe bad habits, and it's not until a crisis happens, everybody stops, and they can reflect, regroup, rethink, and there's some tensions and relational kind of blowouts, and then the family maybe takes on a different route, a new way of operating, relating, that's better than what they had before. This is what happens in organizations as well. And in Korea, path dependence is very strong. Partly because Korean culture is so insular. It's very difficult for fresh ideas to enter and permeate throughout the organization. We have an online site for expat business people, and we frequently get people who work at top echelons of Korean businesses who are invited as perhaps token foreigner white faces in Korean firms who complain. They give me all this work to do, but I don't feel like I'm really making much of a difference. They don't intend on me being here for much longer than 2 or 3 years. I don't feel part of this corporate family. And they feel that way because that's intentional in many ways. They don't want this person to be here that long. They want him to be there just long enough so they can absorb something that they want, but that path dependence moves them in a certain direction that the foreigner is not really kind of in sync with. And so he really doesn't, his way of thinking and worldview and his corporate view doesn't jive or sink in with what everybody's thinking. And then culturally, he's locked out. So there's a problem there. And then crisis in leadership. Just there's an inability now among young people to think how to think differently and live differently. I mean, there's a slow movement for this to happen, but Koreans move in groups. I am the director of the program for IE Business School. IE Business School is top 3 European business school in the world. We do recruiting here in Korea, and what we're finding is that Koreans, if one person is getting an MBA, everybody wants to get an MBA. If everybody is thinking Harvard is the school to go to, everyone's going to move in that direction. We're finding even in our own school that when Koreans come, they tend to think alike, and it's hard for them to think outside the box. And so we particularly have a hard time trying to develop leadership training programs with Korean corporations or MBA students. Lastly, knowledge spillover. What our research shows is that to bypass some of this insular way of thinking is what we see in Korea is, and the increasingly reliant strategy for corporations in Korea is for them to hire outside who are Korean diaspora. And the diaspora are Koreans who were raised in Korea. At some point in their later education, in their master's or PhD level, they will be recruited, they would be admitted to well-known research universities outside, perhaps in the US, Canada, or Australia, somewhere where there's a center of thinking that's very dynamic, innovative. So they go there and they complete their PhD and they work for a few years as well, without really thinking about whether they want to come back to Korea. And this is now the term knowledge spillover and technology transfer is a big topic in business research. And what they're finding is, it's not just for Korea, but what happens is there's a trend of movement of intellectuals and tech-savvy experts in Korea getting their education experience abroad and then bringing that back. Now, you can't lock people, there's labor mobility, you can't control where people will go. But so if someone who's trained here gets educated, say UC Berkeley, starts working in some high-tech, maybe for Qualcomm, acquires some knowledge that really was Qualcomm's internal kind of secret technology for many years, and then finds that Korea's standard of living over the last 5 years, and you know the quality of standard of living in Korea has rapidly improved. I mean, just in the last year, we're seeing just huge leaps of standard of living in Korea. So people are thinking, it's not so bad to go back to Korea. And these companies give them a compensation package that includes benefits for their families. Their kids get exclusive, kind of very posh education programs. And so the availability of these things allow the diaspora to come back. And they work at KAIST, they work at Pulse Tech, they work at Seoul National, but they also do a hefty amount of research work with the corporate sector. So that knowledge spillover is a secret, and it's a big chunk of Asians that are now going to the U.S. I don't know if you know, but the #1 now PhD research group that is being recruited to research institutions in the US are Chinese. Now, China is not a place where the standard of living is high enough, with the exclusion of maybe Hong Kong, for people to want to come back. But that improvement of standard of living is going to be exponentially rapid. I mean, it's just going to go up and up, as it was for Korea. And when the diaspora comes back to China, there's no stopping that knowledge leak where you have research institutions that have spent a lot of money to invest in certain types of things being leaked out to countries that don't have to invest that money. Just hire someone who I just got back from a research conference in Charlotte, and I was with PhD students, and I have to tell you, if you go to these conferences for PhD students in the US, 80% of the students are international students, and the vast majority of them are Chinese and Indians. And they're increasingly not feeling like the US is the place that they want to spend the rest of their life in. I mean, for one reason or another, they're going to go back to their country. So knowledge leak and knowledge transfer is really important. And perhaps for those of us who are from the US, kind of jeopardy, a phenomenon that's happening that's taking many of these developing countries into a different economic prosperity that maybe the US government hasn't really thought carefully about, but it's a boon for countries like Korea. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
So this is a little bit daunting. I've been preceded by some very, very insightful and knowledgeable speakers here. Rather than trying to repeat in different words what's already transpired, let me briefly explain my background. I was one of these fellows from UC Berkeley who worked in the biopharmaceutical industry in California for a number of years, and then decided I wanted international experience. I had spent a little bit of time growing up in South Korea as an army brat, not far from, went to high school not far from where we're sitting now for a year and a half. So I thought, why not Korea? And came to Korea. I was recruited by a company that does contract research. And it's regulated research that is utilized by companies who want to submit their data to regulatory agencies, like the United States Food and Drug Administration or the Korean Food and Drug Administration. And I was recruited based on my specialized knowledge in this area. When I arrived here, I quickly discovered that I was a rare bird. There are very few expats doing this kind of work even today here in Korea. So this is why I was attracted to the company. I'm now in my third company within 4 years. I'm not going to go into the challenges. They've been serious, rather than getting into the details of the big picture of technology and potential, I'm going to kind of pull back here a little bit. First, I want to talk about women and what I've seen in my experience with women in the workplace. The first company I worked at in Korea, we had one woman, the first ever woman in this company. Now, this company is about 50 years old, about 500 people in multiple sites. And the first woman was promoted to 팀장, which is kind of a manager. It's not, maybe even lower than manager. First woman to be promoted to team leader in the company while I was there. She lasted about 6 months before she quit and went to a different company. So I don't know what their status is now, but that kind of made an impression on me. The second company that I worked at was a government research institute. And I was promoted during this transition to a team leader. So I was a team leader at this company and the second company, Korean Government Research Institute. And in that company, we have a kanbuhue, where everybody gets together, that's team leader and above, maybe not all the team leaders, but select ones, and then the bujang, the directors and such. And we had 2 women in that, and I thought that was pretty cool. Soon thereafter, one of them got booted out, and we had 1 woman. And this is a group of about 20. So later on, right about the time that I was leaving, that woman was promoted to be the director of the facility. So I thought I was pretty impressed by that. But she was alone at that level. And I don't know, she's still in that position, I don't know how she's faring. So I've seen, just in the short period of time that I've been here, these kind of things happen. The current company that I work at has no women in major leadership positions. We do have a woman who's a team leader, a couple of women, maybe 3, that are team leaders, but it's kind of a top-heavy organization. And even lowly me, I'm a bujang in this organization, so which is a senior manager or something. But so the role of women is a big challenge. Now, in terms of, I promised to pull back away from some of the details that we've gone on. I want to go into the realm of psychology for a minute. And from my perspective, the thing that the greatest potential that Korea has is what it doesn't have. And that because in some ways there's a blank slate. And that is a huge advantage. And that blank slate is what I see Korea heading towards, which is the ability to really begin to psychoanalyze itself and understand their own biases. Right now, I think most Koreans don't have that ability. I think of all the speakers that we have mentioned, that there's this kind of interconnectedness, one big family, everybody, all Koreans understand what other Koreans are thinking pretty well. They've been trained to understand what's copacetic, what Korean culture is all about. But they have a really hard time understanding what foreigners think about them. And they're very curious about that. Koreans love to find out what foreigners think. And part of that, I think, is that it's the window that Koreans are facing, where they need to be able to step out of their own Korean perceptions and start to really understand their own biases. Why do what's behind me? What's inside of me? Why am I thinking about these things in a certain way? What is what is coloring my perceptions? Once Koreans start to make that leap, it's gonna be a total game changer, because they're not going to have to rely on interviews with foreigners or bringing in some, potentially, maybe this foreigner does know what they're talking about, maybe they don't. But they're a foreigner, so let's bring them into our company because we need an outside perspective. That'll evaporate, because Koreans will be able to do that kind of mental processing on their own. So that is kind of where the one major thing that I think I wanted to contribute at this point.
Well, let me just take a moment to say a few things about a few points that we didn't really touch upon here, some unique sort of factors about Korea and its potential historically. So there are some interesting things about Korea. One is, in the Korean War, essentially all the infrastructure and the government system itself was torn apart. However, although Koreans like to say in 1954 it was the same as Somalia, although it was, that might have been true in terms of feeding yourself, there were people with PhDs in chemistry and aerospace science and other things walking around in Korea, in fact. So it's a very unique environment. It was both a developing country starting from zero, but it also was populated with people with extremely high levels of education. As we may know, traditionally, this is, I guess, the historical background, in Japanese colonial policy, Japan made the decision to put its center of industry in Manchuria and what's now northern Korea. So in fact, unlike most colonial policies, in fact, the best infrastructure was in Korea. Unfortunately, it was in what's now North Korea.
But it's all got blown up.
Well, I mean, anyway. In fact, South Korea did not actually reach the full potential until the late 70s in terms of compared to North Korea. But now it's going at a very fast speed, and that's another thing, is the ability of Koreans to do things which are unprecedented. And I'll take two examples. One would be shipbuilding. Korea, and not in everything, but in many fields, is #1 in the world in shipbuilding and container ships. Normally, countries which are at the top in shipbuilding are countries with enormous navies over long periods of time. I think Korea may be the only country in history which has actually gone to the top in shipbuilding without having an enormous navy. High-speed trains is another example. Korea had relatively few trains, and they built one from Pyongyang, originally from Pyongyang, but from Seoul to Busan, and then they built a high-speed train not that long ago, 8 years, I guess, the project was undertaken. They started building trains with a French company, and started building essentially their own trains, and now they're competing globally to sell high-speed trains. Normally that only happens in countries which have a lot of land and a lot of trains. It's actually very unusual for a country which is actually blocked off at the DMZ to suddenly decide to become a player in this field. And we've seen this consistently. It's actually quite intriguing. I will stop there. I think what we'll do next is I'll ask for questions, and then we'll see how that plays out.
It's very interesting topics and also very good comment from the floors. I got very interesting the contradictions between Joel's comment on the Korean economy based on President Park, and then 30 years as to how to feed their people and family, and also, and nowadays, but I'm sorry that your name not in on this syllabus, but Abraham. Yes, Abraham mentioned that in the 21st century, the new approach is required, like. Korea is too fast dependent, and also there was a good tradition in the past. Now it's an obstacle for the future. So I believe that it's a very good contradiction, and also to overcome. So it is not Korean itself, but every generations, every mankind, based on their histories, and then they have to overcome their challenges in the future. So my question is that, so is it really particular to the Korean nationals, or it is common to in the other countries, Europe's past experience, or in America's past experience, or in Asia?
That's actually a very, very good question. There's a lot of research being done right now about why Korean expatriates, when they leave Korea, have been so amazingly successful through the diaspora that Abraham was talking about. In my generation, most of the Korean population that came to the U.S., a lot of war refugees, post-war refugees, and economic refugees, ended up owning dry cleaners and nail salons and grocery stores and things like that. And the view from the 50th floor penthouse in Manhattan, looking at the Korean grocery store on the street, was those poor little yellow people slaving away in the basement. Whereas very quietly, that grocery store owner was putting his children through a private school that went on to Ivy League, and now his son's a neurosurgeon and his daughter's an attorney, and his cousin is CEO of a major corporation. And that is very consistent with the immigration patterns of the Irish, Italian, and other early generation immigrants into the US. And there is a sentiment now that a lot of what we see as the hyperachievement from Asia is really a part of that immigration pattern. So outside Korea, there is some of that. I take issue a little bit with what Abraham had to say, which was a very good overview of, I think, mainstream thinking in behavioral and organizational behavior. I think in Korea there's a little bit different dynamic, and that dynamic relates to the fact that there is a level of, and you actually touched on this, if we have more time I'd like to engage with you quite a bit, because it's an interesting topic, about the need to be on the bleeding edge of technology. In the space I'm in, which is the IC² Institute at the University of Texas, is historically one of the leading thought centers along with Stanford University, on the process of creating wealth from innovation. And a lot of the terminology that we use and a lot of the thought processes we use are really driven by what's happened in Silicon Valley in the IT industry. I worked for Oracle for almost 6 years. I've been in the IT world most of my career, so I've seen it firsthand. And I am not convinced that everybody has to be on the bleeding edge of technology in order to achieve economic and commercialization success. I think the pace of innovation in the modern world, the implications of the global linkage of computer solutions, and the speed at which the rate of innovation is accelerating is more and more making innovation itself more of a commodity. And the real bottleneck is in the commercialization and implementation space. So that's a very unorthodox and non-standard view of the world, but especially in Korea, I work with innovators that work in industry. And one of the big holes in the US now is that there is a very thin manufacturing layer. As a result, there is very, very little innovation in the space that is built, that is driven around making things. Most of the innovation that happens in the US is not manufacturing process, it's not logistics, it's in electronics, it's in design, it's in, the perception is that our economy is now so big and so expensive that we can only compete in places with very, very, very high margins. Korea is a different situation. Korea, going back to my earlier comment, is built on an economic assumption that break even is success for a business. You don't have to generate 60% quarterly profits. You don't have to be Apple that posted $48 billion in revenue last quarter. It's okay as long as you stay in business, and incremental advantage comes from the longer term. So I think your comment is very insightful to say what's happening here is really consistent with what's happening elsewhere. But there are some Korea-specific wrinkles to it. And I think Abraham's comment about path dependency, linear thinking, is probably the biggest challenge to Korea.
Other questions?
Yeah, actually, on the note of path dependency, which you just mentioned, and going back to Vince's comment about the psychology of psychoanalyzing oneself, I was going to ask if you all had any insights about, well, to what extent such hesitation, risk aversion, or path dependency could be hinging upon the language, hinging upon the fact that compared to French, or compared to German, or even Chinese, there's so many more levels of formality, there's so many more subtle nuances that need to be observed between ranking when exchanging ideas. Because my general notion is, I've been working at a small Korean company for the past 4 months, is that when one chooses to share ideas, whether it's knowledge acquisition or whether it's just sharing a new idea with anyone for whatever reason, there seems to be a lot of 신경, like 신경만이 써. People are just really concerned about how they may offend someone, how they're being observed when they share this language, and if it will be tolerated as something creative, or if it's something to be avoided due to the potential ostracism, whatever penalties might come from being that one who steps across the line. So language for me is a big thing that I think was that popped up in my mind when you all had mentioned the different issues with Koreans stepping across, becoming innovative, if not sharing ideas. Any ideas or comments on it? or if that wasn't clear.
Oh, it's clear, it's just heavy.
Yeah.
I mean, language and culture are so intertwined. Have you ever read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers?
Yes, Korean Air! I wish they could trust about that.
Exactly. Yeah.
If we were, I thought it was sounded kind of bizarre, but what if for one day, like Korea was to completely jettison 존댓말, this formal structure? And I know it sounds impossible, but like in the way this Korean Air story that Malcolm Gladwell outlined did, in order to clarify communication and to exchange the facilitation of ideas between senior managers and young newcomers, with fresh ideas at the price of experience. You have to have them both kind of integrate. I would think to have companies like Google and Apple where they rely on this young talent for ideas and the senior management kind of gives insight. What if Korea was to get rid of that in the business world? Could you imagine like a Dae talking to Sangwoonim, you know, in a formal way, like, hey, I don't think this is a good idea. I've never seen that happen. And I don't assume that happens at the Dae-ups or anything like that.
Well, if I could maybe just say something about this, these things have, they cut both ways. So our purpose is, of course, not to glorify the United States here, which has its own set of problems. You could, I think, classify the United States that Americans love equality so much that they can't stand living with other people who are not equal to them. But then they group into their own little ghettos of rich and poor, or among other axes, and this is also a serious problem. And so for an American, I happen to still be an American, it is sometimes difficult because on the one hand, there are certain parts of Korean culture which are definitely not what I was taught, and sometimes very difficult or painful. On the other hand, sometimes the fact that, for example, wealthy Koreans and not as wealthy Koreans can live in the same neighborhood, right? Or that people can work together in a way is based upon recognition of hierarchy, something which Americans have a lot of trouble with. So it's everything is true that you say, but there are other sides, and of course we find in some other developed countries in Europe and the United States are also. If it was clear that Europe and the United States were, you know, paragons, and Korea was a developing country, then it would have there'd be no conditions at all. But right now, it's a very much more complicated game that we're looking at.
I think, and so maybe it was, who was it that mentioned reverse engineering? Was that Abram? It seems to me like, the one aspect he said that what they do is the spillover of knowledge. They take some ideas back and, you know, you can find out how it was done and how to do it for cheaper, or how to take a similar idea, change it somewhat, and sell it again as a new idea. It seems like that would work really well with this hierarchy, because you don't go, some guy says that works good, he tells all his like under people to just do it, yagen, I don't care, do what you gotta do to do it. And that kind of disciplined, like Bundes-style military hierarchy works really well if you've got to copy something. But when it comes to innovating or thinking of ideas that catch on outside of Korea, instead of then sucking ideas in, Western-style emulation in some senses, not to be ethnocentric, but it seems like that's one reason they could be successful if that kind of mentality is taken when it comes to copying, reproducing, or modifying. But when it comes to this innovation, not crisis, excuse me, but kind of this lack of innovation, it seems like it might be stifled by this 6,000-year-old, well, not the language, excuse me, but by that linguistic culturization that shapes the way people think and interact.
If I could make a comment about that, it's a beautiful thing to see someone, one person's life, someone who tries to live consistently with all of that they know. But very few people are able to do that. Most of us are living examples of various different philosophies and ideas in juxtaposition and conflict. And we're always trying to arrive at some degree of truth, some formation of identity and aim, and culture is that interplay as well. Culture is basically a very big umbrella for subsuming different kinds of systems. Systems which are, if I was to just explain this very simply, they're little games. They're little or we can even say metaphorically, they're like rooms. And so when we make these rooms and we decorate them with what we think is beautiful, and we put things together which represent culture and value and language and all of that, different ethnicities and countries and people groups come up with different ideas for what's appropriate. And for Korea, during the Confucian period, when before there was mad chaos and there was tribal warfare and clan warfare, Confucianism brought people to a place where they can order their thoughts. And as a people group can say, okay, we're going to work together. And that's why in Korea, teamwork is a big positive. It works well because of that Confucian kind of understanding of who I am within the bigger society hierarchy. So at one point in history, that worked really well. But now Korea is rapidly transitioned into this global world where different value systems and aims and ambitions, which are incongruent with what they were used to striving for, has now taken center stage. And so this comes into play when I think about what does Korea really want and what is their identity. They want to be we hear in the press, they want to be a developed country, but that's not what they're looking to be. They want to be recognized as an enlightened country. That's a very different thing. Developed country is having enough revenue, and Korea is, for all purposes, it looks very developed. And they have some things here we can't even find in the US. But that's not what they're looking for. They want to be recognized by outsiders as an enlightened country. And to be that, you have to be a culture that has your own system, that is congruent with everything else, and logically in play and conversant and responsive to all the other systems and value systems that people are upholding as the thing to do in the global sphere. Unfortunately, Korean system is not chic. It's no longer chic anymore. It doesn't seem really congruous. I mean, there's some people who are into Zen, who like Korean Hanok homestay and all of this. They think it's fascinating, but it's not enlightened. They're looking for, and the big thing right now is innovation and all of that, but that's not what the Confucian worldview and philosophy system and identity was all about. It's not the end game people are looking at. Confucian system is all about the pathway, the walk, and the journey itself. And so it's very kind of Eastern, it's very kind of balanced. But right now, with all that we're teaching in the university systems, it's very incongruous. And so when you're saying the language doesn't match what we're living and how we're developing new aims and targets, you're very right. It's very incongruous, but I don't think anyone has an answer for that, except to say what the Japanese have done very well is they've at least tried to be creative about engaging the entire world with what their worldview had to offer. So they tried to adapt it a little bit, and they developed fusion ideas. They said this is how it can be adapted to what you guys know. And so the conversation keeps going, and that's the important thing, I think. Korea's strategically, geopolitically, and also just geography, we're in the center of a lot of different very vibrant cultures that are vying to be enlightened and predominant. And so, it's important for Korea to be engaging in that conversation. That's the point, I think, for us, to be relevant and to be always engaging and learn to just give a little and adapt some other good things from other cultures. And that's what, Korea is trying to do and doing well. But if we stick too much to our system and say, this is how we're always going to do it, we're going to beat on the drums as hard as we always do, then we may lose some people. And we will lose out on the discussion of what is enlightened and how can we move forward to a better identity for ourselves. In business, that's what it's all about. I mean, everyone's coming with competing ideas for a better life. Then you give you this deodorant or this chewing gum. It's an argument for a better life. It's ultimately all the same conversation, but for different things.
Just as an add-on to that, I work with about 200 to 300 small and medium-sized businesses every year, and make a point of asking all of them, what is your objective? What are you trying to do with your business? And the answer is always intriguing, because if you ask an American business person, what are you trying to do with your business? It always comes down to money. And I think that's very reflective of American society. Americans come from everywhere. I mean, we call it a melting pot, but the bottom line is American culture has no common denominator above economics. The economic level, everybody in the U.S. agrees money is what we want. So when you start a business in the U.S., when you talk to a venture capitalist, when you talk to an investment banker, they are all driven by economics. I have, in 4 years of working with SMEs, I've had 2 Korean companies tell me that their #1 objective is to make money. Almost always, they say, I want to make the world a better place. I want to enhance the quality of life for my family. I want to create a legacy. I want to promote the interests of my country and my fellow human beings. And they're not being facetious. I mean, these people really, truly are motivated, as you suggest, by that enlightenment path, by that make the world a better place, by that communal sense. So although it's very frustrating working with, as a foreigner, working within the hierarchy of Korean corporate culture, I think it's important to keep in mind. Have you ever played the game Legacy, the NCSoft game Legacy?
I never have.
You might want to try. NCSoft spent a bunch of money, went to the U.S., opened their office in my hometown of Austin, Texas, and thought they were going to make gazillions of dollars, and were very disappointed to discover, A, that they hired a guy who was really more interested in going to space than selling software, and B, that American game players didn't really care about the layers of intrigue and maneuvering and behavior that's required to advance in a it's basically a Korean mindset, sagobanshik, embedded in a gameplay that just didn't translate. And as a result, after 3 years, they gave up and have a very small presence now. But it's focused on exactly the issue you identified. But I mean, I've often thought a very interesting PhD project for somebody, and this would be hugely politically dangerous and unpopular, would be to do an economic evaluation of the cost of continuing to use Hangul. Because as you drive around Seoul, for those, I don't know how many foreigners in the room read Korean script, and I mean, it's a great story and it's a great national treasure, but I would guess 40% of the words that you read written in Korean are actually adopted words from the West. You know, taeyo, sauna. And I've often wondered, I don't know how you do this, but I've often wondered what the economic cost of continuing to use a writing system that's limited to basically people like me with interest in linguistics and 48 million native speakers, what the economic cost of doing that is in the modern world. And it's another angle of what you're talking about. But it is such an integral and important part of this culture and what it's trying to do that I think most Koreans would say, we don't really care what it costs. That's a part of who we are. I mean, we love Eastern Shin and we love our Korean culture and our Korean heritage. It's as much a part of us as kimchi. And I don't care if you don't like kimchi, that's a part of Korea, and you just have to live with it. So, I guess that's my point, is it is what it is.
I'm Ramchandra from Kyung Hee University. Mr. Ibrahim, you spoke very well. You raised various issues of the Korean society. Are you Korean?
Yes, I'm Korean American.
Oh. You raised various issues of the Korean societies, the current status of the Korean society, the rigid nature of the Korean society, the inward looking and no outward looking. So do you expect any base for the foreigners in the society so that the another thing is that the innovation, the scientific innovation. So do you expect any role of the multicultural society in scientific innovation?
Those are two very difficult questions. Koreans tend to move in and out of various different worlds. And so for your first question, what role does foreigners play in this society? It's really hard to get into the Korean cliques. When you do, you either have to be a hyung or dongseng or nuna, or you fit into this relationship automatically, but if you're a foreigner, you have nowhere to fit. And so in that conversation, there's a different dynamic that happens. So their minds switch. So it's like taking one OS operating system and switching to Windows or switching to Apple, and that's what Koreans are doing all the time. And it's tiring. My students tell me it's tiring speaking to foreigners because I can't follow them all the time in their worldviews and where it links and anchors to different ideas. It wears me out. So then they go back to their groups where they can say, "Oh, nuna," or and everything's everything's implicitly understood without even having to talk about it. People know where to sit, what to say, what to eat, when to eat, how to eat. Everything's already prescribed. And so that's easier for them. And it's tiring to engage the foreigner, but they know they have to do it, and they know it's important because Korea is such a small country. They need to be global. So I think that's going to continue to happen, and that's why in Korea the pressure on young people to learn English and learn it well enough to develop relationships is always stymied by them not being able to know how to relate to a foreigner in the first place. Because it's one thing to say, how are you, fine, thank you, and you, but to move beyond that, to engaging and developing a meaningful relationship is much more difficult. Because a lot of what they're used to is already implicit, it's already hidden, and it's so pervasive, they don't even have to work at it, it's just there. But then for a relationship, they have to constantly work at it, it's tiring, I can't imagine. And then the other question about where does this play in the scientific realm? It's a logical question to ask. I lived right next to Pastreich. They bring in foreigners all the time, and they know this is critical because within themselves, this path-dependent way of thinking, they can't get out of it and escape it. And Koreans are not able to come up with those inventions on their own. They have to be able to come up with new knowledge all the time, and research is not it's good, but it's not on the level of world-class universities yet. I mean, that shows by the rankings in universities. Yes, they know how to publish, they know how to play the game, but being genuine discoveries of discipline-breaking kind of theoretical models coming through. One argument that Koreans are having among themselves is, why don't we have a Nobel Prize winner here in Korea? Why don't we have any? The research is not at that level yet.
I'm not sure that's totally true though.
Well, it's the conversation they're holding themselves.
Yeah.
But I just don't believe it. I think there is actually serious research going on in Korea.
The way you describe this situation is the difference between basic science
Right.
and applied
Technological.
science.
I'm talking about the scientific innovation, not technological innovation.
Well, what I'm getting at is the difference between basic science versus applied science.
Yes.
And so the Nobel Prizes are going to go generally to your basic science
I'm talking about the
researchers.
same.
And this is not an area where Korea has really invested, whereas US and Europe have invested heavily in developing people in the basic sciences.
You're exactly right. The only other comment I'll make, and then we'll be this to that, is have a little patience.
Right.
My father is 81 years old. He was very good friends with a doctor named Henry Eyring, who was the head of the Department of Chemistry at Harvard University. Dr. Eyring's colleague and partner was Dr. Ri, who was designated a living national treasure of Korea and he is known as the father of modern science in Korea. He died 5 years ago. This is a very, very, very young modernization effort of a very, very old place. It's really been, since the end of the Korean War, the first 15 to 20 years were survival level. The real rebuilding of this country started in the 1970s. That means it's less than 4 decades old. When I was practicing law, I used to work at the Kim Il-sung law firm. When I was practicing law here, I saw what was 150 years of labor relations in Europe and the United States take place in less than 3 years. Korea went from no labor unions whatsoever. If you had a labor problem, you called your friend the colonel, he would literally send military troops out to put down any labor organization efforts, to a complete reversal where unions became way too powerful in a very short time. There was a huge tragedy in Busan 3 years after the labor laws were initiated that got everybody to rethink, calm down, settle down. So it's a very, very, very rapid rate of change here. The role of women in Korean society, when I came here in the 70s, it was still very common for women to walk 10 paces behind their husbands, carrying all the baggage and that kind of thing. I mean, that's in my lifetime. What's taken 250, 300, 400 years in Western society has been fast forwarded here at such a tremendous pace. I have tremendous empathy and sympathy for people in Korea, especially people in their 20s and 30s, because how do you know who you are? I mean, your parents were one thing, you've got all this media influence that tells you you're something else. You go to school and are told you're something else. How do you know who you are? And I think that's the biggest challenge to future development for Korea is getting through that rapid rate of transition without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I mean, when coming from the United States, it's one of the biggest differences.
We'll answer your question, I promise.
Eventually.
Go ahead.
You started. You've actually touched on what I was going to raise in my question as you were talking there at the end, and it's the fact that everything has happened so quickly in Korea that it takes time for cultures to catch up. You know, you don't see rapid change, anywhere quite this fast. I have to tell you this though, like on your motivation for business, I created my business for a reason that had nothing to do with money. And it may be because I'm Canadian and not American.
That explains a lot.
But I was educated in the States, so there's a little bit of that in there. I have to say though that a lot of what you were saying, Abraham, you put a terminology, words, labels to ideas and observations that I have made over the years, but didn't have that label, so I'm hoping I remember the labels to this. But I worked in a Korean bureaucracy over 10 years ago. And I see, in terms of the frustrations that I had as a foreign person with an inflated title and no responsibility, the same kind of thing happening over a decade later, still happening in terms of that. So there hasn't been major change, in my view, in that area. That said, I've also seen major change in that area because there are more people being brought in than there were at that time. I was a very unusual person in the fact that I was female and I had gray hair. And that was not something you would see that often at the time. And I see more people coming in. I see more educated Korean women. I see people who are bringing ideas back from outside. No, it's not impacting the structure right away, but it is happening. And I think what I was going to ask in terms of a question, but you started to answer it there a bit ago, is that relationship that Korea will have with the world in terms of research, in terms of business, in terms of the other thing I think Korea is looking for, other than enlightenment, which is recognition. And I think that's where that Nobel discussion happens, because the Nobel Prize is not just in sciences, and the discussion isn't just about sciences. It's about, it's time for Korea to get an international recognition of our value, of our strength, of our greatness. So where do you see it going in terms of sort of the relationship with doing business on the outside with some of the things that we were talking about? That can be anybody.
I want to just make a comment about the Nobel Prize and also related to how Korea is shifting. There are, of course, some habits are the same as they were 10 years ago, but there's an enormous demographic issue, which is the absence of children in the Asian society, which actually may drive Korea to become more international, whether its establishment wants it or not. And we already see that already happening. In fact, I've been in Korea for 5 years, and I feel very strongly in those 5 years that the number of people from what you say sort of international creative class, capable, thoughtful people who are flowing around the world that come to Korea looking for opportunities has gone up dramatically. And the quality of people I meet in Seoul on a daily basis is quite different than it was 5 years ago. In the case of the Nobel Prize, I made a misstep there in that I think about a Nobel Prize against all fields. And I would say that there are scholars in Korea, if their works were translated properly into English, and they were published in the New York Times Book Review, or in other places, I guarantee that they are eligible to be Nobel Prize winners. And that probably one of the biggest issues has been that Korea has not made it a priority to translate and to introduce the idea of its thinkers internationally. And there's a tendency to focus on a few fields, like electronics, but to think of someone in sociology, right, for example, or someone in literature would be worth, investing millions of dollars to promote as an intellectual thinker. You don't have someone like, I wrote an article recently that talked about a professor at Seoul National University, Ji-hyun Lee, who's written on Central Asia. He wrote a book about the forgotten cultures of Afghanistan, which I thought was one of the best books I read in recent years. 100% in Korean, there's no translation of it anywhere. But I thought, if this book was translated into English by an expert, it would be a New York Times bestseller list, but it's simply not translated.
I'm not sure we're responding.
Oh, but I'm sorry.
No with that.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Go ahead, answer.
Well, I don't really have an answer. I mean, it's a very good question, and it's a very, you've obviously had a lot of experience and a lot of chance to see the beginning inklings of change. One thing I will say about a competitive advantage and disadvantage Korea has is that when things change here, they change instantly.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I think is going to happen for women.
Right.
And I apologize for missing the part of your talk, which is what I wanted really to hear.
But because she's a woman and she overachieves, she has a PowerPoint presentation and related materials. The rest of us are just talking over there.
But yeah, I think 'cause when women move here, I think it's going to happen very quickly. Because we have what we didn't have in North America as I was growing up, and women were asserting themselves and trying to get out of the kitchen. Educated female population. And that to me is a strength that Korea has. And for a lot of the frustrations that we have as foreign people working here with some of the hierarchy and the language and things that were pointed out earlier, women are the ones who can break that.
Yeah.
And it's easier for us to work with them. I don't know if I'm repeating myself.
Maybe I should just say a little thing about a few words on Nobel Prize in Science. I think the scientists in Korea really even feel a little bit uncomfortable hearing about this the Nobel Prize in Science, because a lot of the scientists in Korea, like businessmen, not seeking for money, they are seeking just for the invention or discovery. But usually the Nobel Prize in Science, the media is talking about that a lot. And one of the reasons is, as you said, is a recognition, as well as the some role models for the youngsters. The Korea attracted a lot of very bright people, bright youngsters into science before, but not anymore. So that's another reason. So I don't really think that scientists are talking about the Nobel Prize in Science. And also, as someone already said, that the basic science we invested only very last few, well, like it's very the tradition is really short, and we invested not very much, and also the engineering was more. We invested more in engineering than basic science. It's just a few years to start to invest in basic science. So yeah, probably recognition would be the answer. And also another thing, although like the Korean women in science actually worked very hard to promote themselves, to convince the government to introduce some of the programs for the women, for example, the recruitment and so on. But as Amy said, that a lot of things done in Korea, not formally, like over the dinner, over the drinking. So the women are now part of them. So they are left out of the decision all the time, even though they are in the right positions. So that I think that's part of the reason that it's very difficult for women to be in a proper the leadership position.
Maybe we'll take 2 more questions.
So I guess first of all, my interest is in Latin America and in particular Brazil and the relationship to Korea. Probably because Sao Paulo has the largest population of Koreans outside in that region, right? But I just heard that Songpa in 2011 they got the same Sustainable City Award that Curitiba, Brazil got in 2010, and that innovation and urbanization attracted a lot of attention to Brazil, which is a problem. But anyway, my question is, so I guess what can universities, you kind of mentioned it, but what can universities and SMEs do And what are they going to do over the next 50 years to attract and retain high-value human capital? Maybe in the next 50 years and even past that.
Are you talking about faculty or students?
Students, employees, both.
It's a great question.
I have a suggestion. One of the issues that I see here in Korea that I think is very limiting in many different realms, and it's tied into the basic science problem, is that Koreans work very, very hard, and they're really good at working hard, but they don't play hard very well. And basic science,
Obviously not have enough service.
I don't consider that, I mean, those episodes are over pretty quick, usually. I mean, you go out drinking and people are drunk out of their mind by 8 p.m. and it's over. What I'm talking about is people going to places like this, art galleries, going on trips where they're not surrounded by, they're not part of a Korean tour group going bam, 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 bam through, waking up at 8 in the morning and seeing all the sights and with 30 minutes at each place and racing to try and do everything. I'm talking about relaxing, being able to engage, learn, put that energy that's required to engage with foreigners, to get outside of their field. So that people put themselves into these boxes, to take that box away and open themselves up to be able to learn something outside of their field. And it's that cross-pollination that allows innovation, that allows basic science research to happen. Because the applied sciences is all based on this nest that had been discussed earlier. This nest that allows incremental advances. That's just that path is very limited. To be able to play hard and to play at all, to have that ability to get out of your skin and to be able to see things from a totally different perspective, that creating a culture and an environment where that's encouraged, that's what's going to attract that creative capital that you're looking for. And that is one of the biggest challenges that I think Korea faces.
Last question.
Yeah, maybe it's not a question. Yes. I think today's discussion and speeches were very interesting and helpful for Korean to understand what other foreigners think about Korea's economy, tradition, and society, and workplace and family ground. And I think it's a good time for us to discuss this kind of issue, because after the Korean War, Korea has experienced such a rapid development in economy. Everything was concentrated on economic development, nothing else. Sacrificing family, sacrificing my own life, sacrificing my parents' life. Everything was lost just to save the economy within such a short period of time. Now it's time for us to consider what is to be in front of us, because the economy has developed a little bit enough to sustain such a decent life compared to other Western European countries. Now European countries and American countries are giving attention to the one issue. Who is Korean? Not what is Korea's economy, what is their business? What can we make through their business together? Now it's time for them to say, who is Korean? What we should understand, what we should know about Korea for the future. We experience such an agony, we experience such an uncomfortableness so far. My job is actually maneuver the communication between Korean businessmen and international business people who are doing business together. So recently, I got a chance to meet with the new ambassador of India to Korea. And I told him, do you know, it's been only 2 decades between two countries achieving such a great, huge amount of trade volume. But do you know that? Indian people are not satisfied with Korean businessmen. Korean businessmen are not satisfied with Indian businessmen. The more ironical thing is, there has been no effort or attempt to solve the problem. What's going on? Because they have been satisfied with making money so far. But as the economy issue is now settled down almost, you said, Dr. Mumber, that 60% of GDP comes from just certain big companies in Korea. What does it mean? It can be weakness, but it can be also great strength. Because in this small country, we can generate such a big amount of economic success from just a certain company. It means that they are the great leaders in world economies business. So business economy is no longer a big issue for Korea. Now, the biggest issue of Korea and the biggest issue for foreigners who are dealing with the Koreans in public sector and private sector is how much we understand Korea. Because if we can understand, as Abraham Lee said, and you said, if we can understand deeply about who is Korean, who are they, we can make a big leap in business, in economy, and in culture. So I think it's a great time. You said that you have some difficulty in communicating with your boss in your company, right?
At times, yes.
Yeah, sometimes. Please understand that we have 6,000 to 7,000 years of history. We've developed a novelty. We developed a lineage, tradition, customs. Such a small and molecular aspects are embedded in every aspect of our life and communication in our spirit. How can you come up with such a detailed and complicated structure within such a short period of time as a foreigner who are not having such a same or similar background? Right? I think it's natural.
So what he's saying is you should be grateful it's not 150 years ago because they would just kill you.
So, but it was great, it was good luck for me to watch this time to see foreigners trial, foreigners sincere effort to understand Korean, not just to seek an opportunity to make money from here, but basically and fundamentally to understand who is Korean. What can be the best thing or good thing for Korean to do for the future, and what can be done as foreigners to be abreast with such a future development of Korea as foreigners. I think it's a great time to be here tonight.
I want to make one point.
All right.
Whether I am Korean, whether I am American or Indian doesn't matter. What is important is that we all need to remember that the success in the past cannot give guarantee of the success in the future. So we have to be always innovative in all aspects so that our life will be better.
Okay, the last comment.
I come from an art history of design background. You mentioned about stepping out of Korean's own perception. Could you elaborate a little bit more about how? In my personal view, I think there's more job that Koreans need to do finding their own identity, because it's through my research process that I discovered that the history is so fragmented and there hasn't been a uniform view of or little information about some of the past history. And also there's this political separation that needs to be resolved, or thinking about what Koreanness is, or Korean is, but in reality, has developed, and I think it's in process of trying to step out of its own perception. But could you elaborate about like what are some of the priorities or issues or changes that needs to be done in terms of achieving, like going towards making that happen?
Well, that's very challenging, very challenging. I think that when I gave my little introduction when we went down the row, the point that I was really trying to make, and I think that this really is pivotal in a core issue and in many different issues, is this understanding of what your own biases are. And it's in the most simple way, if you can understand what it is that where you're coming from is the phrase, where you're coming from, where you, what are the things that color your perception of things around you, of the people around you. It is so powerful, I think. Now, I think a lot of us here sitting, I think 3 of us are Americans. Now, Americans had a real challenge with this, very direct challenge in our history, because it's the melting pot country, right? And we had some really serious problems around racism in all of our lifetimes. And based on that history and the education that a lot of Americans had to go through, this has become really, for some of us more than others, kind of a mantra. If you're aware of these issues, if you try to be enlightened from an American perspective, I think it's one of the core issues, this understanding what your own biases are. Now, as far as how, otoke, I don't know. I'm not Korean, right? So it's you know, one of the most difficult questions to challenge anybody who's going through school, for example, is what is it that you really want to do? What is it that you really want to? Well, you know, I've got these here are the different programs that are available to me to go through school. No. Forget about that. What do you want to do? What is your goal? Those are the kind of self-reflective questions that stump everybody, that are so difficult. So this challenge that Korea is facing, foreigners can't answer for them. They can't. It has to come from Koreans. And I'm just throwing it out there as having lived here a total of 6 or almost 7 years of my life, I've kind of working here as an adult. This is what I think is the most pivotal challenge. And if it can be dealt with, all of these other issues, like this issue of basic science and getting a Nobel Prize, of why is the birth rate declining in Korea, and why can't women function in Korean society effectively, all of those kind of issues will start to dissolve. But I see this as the root cause issue. And I applaud your work that you're doing, because I think that is so much more important than working on the smallest transistor or the best solar cell collector. I think that all of those other issues will fall out if you can come up with the solution that you're challenging.
So that Jung made the last comment?
Not comments.
Question, okay.
Okay. We have actually discussed quite long. Still, some of the notion on Korean is that the Koreans are working very hard. They're very good at copying. And often, Koreans said we have actually a lack of creativity. And I'm wondering whether that's really the case. You have actually stayed here for several years. I think in some sense I admit that we may have actually maybe a lack of creativity compared to, say, Western people who are raised in Western culture. Can you say, give some suggestions how Koreans can improve their?
I'm going to start because this is I have a contrarian view to this, which is that I think that there is a great deal of creativity and a great deal of innovation going on in Korea. What's lacking is the ability to get that creativity and innovation out of Korea. I see the innovators that I work with create new inventions, new products, new ways of doing things that are unique in the world. That have never, I have one innovator, for example, that's doing a deal with the largest tier 1 OEM in Detroit right now, who invented a new way of, at a very fundamental level, of manipulating aluminum as a material for fabrication of automotive components. Patented, international patent protection, and he will become an industry standard. And he had 8 employees when he came into our program. He just finished his 5th manufacturing facility, and this year he'll do $25 million in revenue. That's a guy that, had he not come across the right conduit for his creativity, would have been stuck off in a rice paddy in Hwasong City, and no one would ever have heard of him or heard of his product outside. He might have sourced into a tier 3 supplier into Hyundai Kia. So I think that historical view that Koreans are just imitative and that the Confucian education system creates linear thinkers who can't think creatively may be true in a very gross, sort of unmeaningful level. But I think you have to look behind that cultural patina, veneer, and look underneath that, because there are real strong innovators and entrepreneurs in this country. Korea had a social networking solution that worked almost exactly like Facebook 7 years before anyone ever heard of Facebook. Why didn't that become the international standard? Why isn't that a $100 billion IPO? It's not because the innovation isn't there. It's because the commercialization conduit isn't there.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to point out something critical to this. If you look at it from the very basic sense of how we gain creativity, I always tell my students, you cannot get creativity out of a vacuum. Meaning, if a child, through their youth and their education, they did a research. You have 2 rats. You put one rat, and this was my professor when I was in undergrad doing neurology research. You put a rat in a cage with no toys. You put a rat in a cage with lots of toys, interesting colors, lots of things to play with. Then you put the 2 rats in a maze and have them come out of that maze. The rat, consistently, with a lot of toys, does much better than the rat that had no toys. So they killed the rat, and then they opened up the brain and they tried to find out what's different about the 2 rats. What they find is, when you're using and being exposed to a lot of outside sensory things, the brain actually gets bigger. They found actually the white matter, which is the outside part of your brain, actually grows from the interaction. Now, the reason why I mentioned this is because I'm finding that, from my understanding of Korean young people when they're going through their education, they live in a concrete jungle most of the time. They're in school, in that building, for an enormous amount of hours, with very little intellectual or outside stimulation except from what's mandated in the curriculum. And that goes on from very early age to all the way through university years. And it's only recently that many people have and the wealthy people have the opportunity to go outside the country and to look at other things. They're so busy with their textbook, they can't even sit down and look at a magazine. Creativity and innovation doesn't come out of the vacuum. The education system has to change. Sending young people to Hagwons and then mandating them to play the piano and the violin and all of this, it's a strain, and one person can only do so much. I was actually quite surprised when I came and I saw so many students do this. Our school actually tries to backtrack and not do that, and give young people school hours, but give them ample time to explore and discover. That discovery is an important intellectual journey by itself that has to be emphasized in Korea. But again, Korea is so much into doing things in a very logical and very systematic way. That's good, but what's happening is we're making drones. We're making people who all think alike without any new idea. If I can just close with one other research that came out. They took two groups. One group was all Caucasian people, Americans, from the same social economic background. The other group had Hispanics and black and white people and Asians all mixed. And they gave them each a project to do to see who could do it better with better ideas, more creativity. This group, the white group, finished the task faster and everybody was happy with each other. Their attitudes were still very positive and confident, but the ideas that they came out with was much lower. This other more diverse group took longer. And the way in which they developed teamwork, it was very tumultuous. There was conflict, there was arguments, and it took longer. But when they came out with the final result, they had more diverse input and creativity out of that. And if you transpose that research finding to what we have in Korea, what that speaks to us is we need to nurture that diversity that we're having in Korea these days. More ideas, more people allowed to speak. If you look at a Korean boardroom, most of the people already know where to sit and who's going to speak and who's not going to speak. And all the ideas in places like Samsung comes from the top down. Trickle down. It doesn't come up from people who know and have interaction with the market. It doesn't filter up. My own friends who work in the corporate sector always tell me, I want to escape Korea because I can never get my own ideas expressed. So again, creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum, and we need to nurture an environment to foster more diversity of ideas.
Mr. Ibrahim, you are 110% right.
Yeah. On the question of creativity, I would just note that you might look at, say, Korean buildings, for example, new apartment buildings, and say there's a remarkable lack of creativity in how they're designed. And you might come to the conclusion, well, Koreans are not that creative, or there aren't that many creative Koreans. Then you go over to, say you pick up a copy of Art in America, for example, and you'll discover that maybe 20% of the artists are in fact Korean Art of America, the best creative minds in the world in some respect. So there is in fact an enormous group of extremely creative Koreans. The problem has been more that they have not been integrated into this decision-making process for how you design cities, how you build buildings, how you make cars, and that's starting to happen.
Yeah, and to reconcile these two apparently contradictory positions, I think there is a great deal of creativity in Korea in spite of, not because of the education system. I think Abraham's comments about the education system are spot on, and I think we all have experience with people that have been through that system and seen the life beat out of young people after 120 hours a week in studying in Hogwarts. But in spite of that, I find in the innovators I actually work with on a day-to-day basis an amazing level of creativity, ingenuity, that spark of curiosity. And it's amazing that it hasn't been beat out of them in some ways. And part of it is because of the demographic. Because I work with people, most of the innovators I work with started at Samsung or Hyundai, Kia or LG or whatever, spent 7 to 10 years there, and as you suggest, got to the point where they just had to go do something creative. And they're out there. They're hard to find and they're well camouflaged, but they're definitely there.
Well, I want to thank our presenters for joining us today, and thank our audience for coming out for this Asian Student Seminar. We will have more, and I hope in the future we'll be able to focus maybe on very specific fields as we go forward. Thank you again.